The American Revolution cast a republican fervor throughout the nation. Primogeniture, indentured servitude, and the mingling of church and state were well on their way to being abolished. However, slavery and women's rights would remain issues for many more generations to come. The new government under the Articles of Confederation completely failed because it did not create a strong enough central power. The unicameral Congress that was created could not enforce tax collection or regulate commerce, so it had no efficient way to pay off its debts. The discord in the country was made obvious by Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays was an impoverished war veteran and backcountry farmer who had lost his farm due to debt. He had not been paid for his service in the Revolutionary War, so he started an uprising in Massachusetts with hundreds of others like him. This rebellion scared the elite like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. In 1787, 55 delegates met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, but they decided to scratch the document completely and start fresh. The delegates were conservative and pretty well off money-wise. They wanted a firm and respected Republican government where they could still remain the ultimate power. After the Constitution was finished and submitted to the states for ratification, two groups arose: the Anti-Federalists, who did not want it ratified, and the Federalists, who did. In the end, the Federalists won and the Constitution was adopted on June 21st, 1788. Once the Constitution was put into effect, the Electoral College unanimously drafted George Washington as President of the United States in 1789. The new Congress set up the Supreme Court with John Jay as the Chief Justice in the Judiciary Act of 1789. Washington selected Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton to be his Secretary of Treasury. Hamilton got to work immediately and proposed to shape the fiscal policies of the government to suit the rich, who would in return lend the government support. Through this, the government would thrive, the rich would get richer, and prosperity would trickle down to the masses. He also proposed a Bank of the United States, but had to battle Jefferson, who argued that it was unconstitutional. Hamilton eventually won, and it was chartered in 1791. Not everyone was happy, however, with the new government. Pioneers in southwestern Pennsylvania rebelled against the excise tax on whiskey in 1794 because it was financially hurting them. Washington sent 13,000 troops to crush the whiskey rebellion, but he pardoned the culprits. This move by Washington commanded new respect for the government, but foes condemned it as an unnecessary display of force. When the French Revolution broke out in 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, a smart move, but many were outraged. He stepped down in 1787, and John Adams became the next president. The XYZ affair and the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts are two major things that define his presidency. Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800. His election is known as the Revolution of 1800 because power was passed from the Federalists to the Jeffersonian Republicans without any bloodshed. Before John Adams left the presidency, he appointed Federalists to open government positions. These appointments were known as midnight judges. Not all of the appointments were filed, and the new Secretary of State, John Adams, hid away the appointments that had not been filed the next day. William Marbury, one of the midnight judges whose appointment was not filed, sued Adams under writ of mandamus, which was supported by the Judiciary Act of 1789. In the case, Chief Justice John Marshall refuted the Judiciary Act and established the concept of judicial review. In 1803, the U.S. was able to purchase the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for $15 million. Jefferson was not sure if buying the land was constitutional, but the offer was too good to pass up. In 1807, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act, which forbade the export of all goods from the U.S., in an effort to hurt France and Britain, but it only hurt the American economy. 3 days before Jefferson left office, Congress replaced it with the Non-Intercourse Act, which reopened trade except for with Britain and France. In 1809, James Madison became the next president. James Madison was the first wartime president. The War of 1812 is America's worst fought war. The burning national outrage had dissipated, and the army was poorly trained, scattered, and was run by old generals. The strategy that was used for capturing Canada was horrible. It was a three-pronged attack set from Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain, all of which failed. In 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry and other Americans built a fleet of ships, which were able to capture a British fleet, but this was the only achievement during the war. In 1814, British troops landed in the Chesapeake Bay area and marched to Washington, D.C. After the American army had fled, they proceeded to burn down the capital. At Baltimore, the victory at Fort McHenry inspired the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. The most important victory was fought in 1815 after the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed. The Battle of New Orleans made Andrew Jackson famous because he was able to fight off 8,000 British soldiers with 7,000 poorly trained men. The Treaty of Ghent was really only an agreement to stop fighting because it did not resolve the original issues. Following the war came the era of good feelings, which saw the rise of nationalism under President Monroe, but the era was actually filled with economic hardships. In 1819, an economic panic descended on the country. In the election of 1824, Jacksonians accused John Quincy Adams of buying Henry Clay's electoral vote by promising to make him Secretary of State after he was elected president. The Jacksonians were outraged when Adams won presidency, since Andrew Jackson won the most of the popular votes, so they called the deal the corrupt bargain. Adams turned out to be a not-so-great president. He was a thinker rather than a politician, and he focused on nationalism while the country was turning to sectionalism. In the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson finally won the presidency. He started the spoils system and passed the Tariff of Abominations in 1828, which led to the nullification crisis with South Carolina. Luckily, Henry Clay saved the day by supporting the Compromise Tariff of 1833, which halted the crisis for a while. Jackson scorchingly vetoed the Second Bank of the United States' renewal charter because he distrusted monopolistic banking and over-big businesses that favored the rich elite. Before the bank died, its president, Nicholas Biddle, called in all its loans in a war with Jackson, which resulted in an economic crash and the Panic of 1837. In 1836, Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's choice for presidency, became president, but he spent the majority of his administration dealing with the panic that Jackson had left him. In 1840, William Henry Harrison became the next president. By the mid-1800s, America was on the path toward becoming a huge world power, but it was not quite there yet. Americans were starting to feel a sense of pride in the pristine nature of the American wilderness. In the 1840s, millions of Irish immigrated to America and settled in the slums of big cities. 1.5 million Germans also came over during this time period, but they were rich enough to buy land and settle out west. The cotton gin was invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney, which made cotton growing highly profitable again and made the South even more dependent on their slaves. Factories first flourished in New England, but early factory conditions were horrible and had low pay, so the people were known as wage slaves. The majority of women in factories were single, and when they married, they would quit their job to join the cult of domesticity and fulfill the Republican motherhood role. Turnpikes and steamboats revolutionized transportation in the early 1800s. The Erie Canal was finished in 1825 and allowed for east-west transportation. Finally, the railroad, which appeared in 1828, provided a fast, reliable, and cheap method of transportation that could go almost anywhere. Church attendance in the 1800s was at a steady 75% of the population, but many relied on deism, which relied on reason rather than revelation. Deism also inspired Unitarianism, which stressed essential goodness of humans and salvation through good works. These new branches spurred the Second Great Awakening, which swept up even more people than in the first. It was hardcore in the north, but not so much in the south and west. It also led to the building of small schools. Peter Cartwright and Charles Finney were two famous revival preachers. It also widened lines between North and South as churches split between these two regions. In 1830, Joseph Smith started Mormonism after receiving golden plates from an angel deciphered into the Book of Mormon. They were harassed by others, and Smith was eventually killed. Brigham Young then took over and moved the community to Utah. Horace Mann is known as the father of public education. He fought for better schools, longer school terms, higher pay for teachers, and an expanded curriculum. Women were also prominent during this time period in reform crusades such as anti-cruelty, war, alcohol, and slavery.